Good afternoon, everyone. I think we've got about 28 people in so far, and so we'll start the process of doing the introductions, and then I'll hand over to Dr. David Younger, and he'll be able to take us on the presentation today. So I wish to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. And I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm joining you from the land of the Ngunnawal people this afternoon. Today's webinar is being presented by Australian Red Cross. Red Cross's recovery program is based upon the Australian National Disaster Recovery Principles and draws upon the Community Recovery Handbook, research from the Beyond Bushfires research program, as well as our own domestic and international experience. It also contributes to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction with a focus on building back better. Red Cross has been supporting the recovery of rural, regional, urban and Indigenous Australian communities post-disaster since 2006. The Australian Red Cross disaster recovery programs are all hazards focused, consequence focused, and work closely with local services, all levels of government, community groups and communities. As a result of this result of our community-led approach, all of our recovery programs are reflective of the communities with which we work. Red Cross adds value to recovery processes through having a trusted, neutral, independent role within communities that draws upon a unique national and international network of expertise, including other Red Cross national societies, academia, business, and community organisations. Following the 2019-2020 bushfires, Red Cross is committed to a 3-year recovery program across New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and South Australia. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's webinar is being recorded. We will share the link with you after the recording so that you can revisit some of the content yourself and share it with your networks. We also invite you to your comments and questions. And please look at the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and you can put your questions in there. You can also type them into the chat panel. And if you have any questions for David at any point, just type them there and my colleague Arjun, who I'll introduce to you in just a minute, will either pose them to David at the time or hold them for the discussion portion, which is at the end of each of the sections that David will be talking about. David Younger is a clinical and consultant psychologist that's been working with within the disaster recovery space since the Black Saturday fires in 2009. He's worked with in a variety of settings and is passionate about assisting people to improve wellness and health. In addition to private practice, David consults to the emergency management and private sectors. He focuses on the provision of training and development, community recovery and consultation, as well as driving innovation in preparedness, building resilience, and the role of community in recovery, self-care and trauma recovery. Welcome, David, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jessie.
I'd also like to take this opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Jessie Heward. I am the state lead for New South Wales for our recovery program. And I'd like to introduce Arjun Cheema to you as well, who is one of my colleagues in our national program. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And I will now share the presentation, David, and we'll let you get started.
Sure, thank you. All right, thanks so much, Jessie. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to the Red Cross as well for sponsoring and supporting our facilitation of this session this afternoon. Most importantly, though, thanks to all of you that have chosen to join this session, to take the time out of your day and the time out of your week. Very much appreciated. So we have through until approximately 4 p.m. today. There's a number of sections that I'd like to work through. So I guess the key thing to say here is that there is content that I'm aiming to share with you, but I've also very much structured it in a way so that there is some time for conversation and chat and questions. So at the end of each main section, what I'll do is pause. It'll provide an opportunity for those questions or comments to come through, and Arjun will probably help me with those and read them out to me. So the key sections that I want to share with you today, there we go, bit of a delay there with the slides, everyone, that's all. There are 5 main sections here today. So with these sorts of sessions and webinars, we're never entirely sure what people's backgrounds are. And at the moment, if I could just keep control of the slides, thanks. And with the webinars, we're never exactly sure what people's backgrounds are and what their work experiences are. So I've structured this and also built content into it that hopefully is quite broadly applicable to everyone that's decided to join the session. But also what I emphasise is that although there's a focus placed here on what's important in the context of assisting and supporting individuals, both in the early aftermath and across the duration of recovery, what's also very much fundamentally important to realise is that we need to build and develop an understanding of working in a community context and working in a disaster recovery context. That's a really important additional sort of bank of knowledge and understanding to have that can be blended with already existing individual clinical and therapeutic skills. So what I'm going to aim to do in this session is to firstly provide a context for disaster recovery. I want to touch on protective factors, both individual and community. And then I want to talk about early intervention strategies and clinical intervention strategies, the early intervention in particular in a disaster recovery context. And then at the end, if everything goes according to plan and my timing has worked, I'll be able to wrap the entire webinar up in a community recovery focus and really try to pull together some of the key points and issues. So the aims here approximately are to gain an understanding of commonly used psychosocial recovery terms and language. I want to raise your awareness to both individual and community-based protective factors in a disaster and emergency recovery perspective. Then, as I've mentioned already, raise your awareness to early intervention strategies, then clinical intervention strategies, and then finally work to build an understanding of key community psychosocial recovery processes and principles. That's the aim today. Oh, sorry about this, the slide's just skipping through. So just to orient you and provide a bit of a context as to really where we're at the moment in terms of extreme weather events. You may or may not be aware, but in well, I'm sure you're aware of this, but 2018-19 in Australia, every single state experienced serious bushfire. In Townsville, of course, in 2019, we had a 10-day rainfall record with 1,500 homes being destroyed. In Texas in 2017, there was Hurricane Harvey, and they had the most significant rainfall they've ever experienced, with a 1 in 9,000 year probability of experiencing that much rain. In Japan in 2018, a record heat wave that caused 80 deaths. Sweden in 2018, forest fires and the largest ever coordinated EU response. And then, of course, there is what we are experiencing at the moment in terms of COVID-19. And regrettably, the forecasts are that extreme weather events will just continue to become more frequent and more intense. So I wanted to share with you some first-hand experiences of disaster because some of you won't have worked yet with individuals impacted by a disaster event like bushfire. Some of you will, but I think it is important to get an insight into what that first-hand experience can actually be like for somebody, because most of us haven't experienced this, and therefore we don't really have a grasp or an understanding of how significant it is. So here's one person's experience. Then very quickly, it all got very scary. I went outside and the sky was engulfed by this enormous brown, disgusting cloud. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. bushfire. And, you know, if I just point out here, the sensory elements of a disaster experience are often incredibly intense and incredibly significant. Then suddenly the roof just started opening up like a sardine can, and instantly the wind was in the house. And he was telling me there were thoughts he might have to get his foot amputated because he'd volunteered to come and clean up the floodwaters. This was actually in Townsville. So what is a disaster? I guess I'm just working here with terminology and wanting to share a few things with you. So a disaster can be considered to be a sudden calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community. So already we're seeing this community aspect come in, or society, and causes material and economic or environmental losses that far exceed the community's or that society's ability to cope using its own resources. And they're often caused by nature. Disasters can have human origin. So I put this in here because the terms disaster and emergency are used interchangeably, and sometimes there's some confusion about the differences, which are in fact quite subtle. And what I'll mention shortly is that these terms can be used interchangeably. An emergency, on the other hand, is this is how the definition that exists in Victoria, is the actual or the imminent occurrence of an event which in any way endangers or threatens the safety or health of any person in Victoria, any property, the environment, an earthquake, flood, windstorm or other natural event, a fire, an explosion, a road accident or any other accident, a plague or an epidemic, a warlike act, a hijack, siege or riot, or a disruption to an essential service. So let's then sort of have a look at and talk about what community is. And I want to start that by just again sharing with you some community members' first-hand experiences. So the importance of community. Here's another quote coming from someone in New South Wales who said that they have the most amazing community, that I'm still in complete awe at how quickly the community came together and rallied to help where they could. If ever anything was needed, the call was put out and shortly it arrived after. And then in Townsville, that there's nothing better than giving back to your community and serving your community. It's an opportunity to use your skills and your knowledge to help and support others. So how do we define community and how might we think of community? Well, here's one perspective, and that is of a social, a religious, an occupational or another group sharing common characteristics or interests and perceived or perceiving itself as distinct in some respect from the larger society within which it exists. So, you know, I'll typically mention or use examples of rural communities, whether they're in Victoria or whether they're in New South Wales or some other state, you know, and make the comment that those communities typically have their own sense of self, their own identity, and they identify themselves as being quite separate and quite distinct from even the rural town that's just 25, maybe 50 kilometres down the road, and certainly very, very different from you know, a metropolitan area generally. You know, other characteristics of communities are their geographical location, the demographic of the community that comprises it. You know, we might have other clubs or activities or other things that are relevant to that particular community. Now, I want to just touch on trauma and recovery, and of course in a webinar that's this sort of length of time, it's not possible to go into infinite detail, so I'm also working on assumption that most of the people here have some sort of pre-existing awareness or understanding of trauma at least, and in some ways recovery. I think a starting point is to mention that for those of us that work in the field that are health professionals or allied health professionals, we would certainly expect to have some sort of awareness of clinical diagnostic criteria for diagnosing, in relation to diagnosing somebody that has suffered or experienced trauma. And we would probably be thinking about using the diagnostic criteria in DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or ICD-10, actually ICD-11 now, there's a newer edition. And those of you who are familiar with the diagnostic process, of course, realise and know that there are specific criteria that need to be fulfilled in order for somebody to be given a diagnosis of a trauma and stress-related condition or disorder. But what I want to emphasise as well is, we can also look at trauma from less clinical perspective. So, for instance, we could consider trauma to be an event in the person's life defined by its intensity, the person's incapacity to respond adequately to it, and by the upheaval and long-lasting effects that it brings: mental, physical, emotional, social, and spiritual. And I bring this into it because diagnoses and the criteria provide us with essentially a list of symptoms or experiences that people have. For example, when they are experiencing ongoing traumatic impact or effect, but they don't necessarily encapsulate what the experience is for the whole person. I saw a question come through on chat asking what the acronym PTE stands for. That stands for a potentially traumatic event. And the word potentially is used because we know and understand that exposure to a traumatic event does not necessarily equate ongoing trauma for a person. So the word potentially is used. Psychosocial recovery. Then I wanted to talk about this. So now we're looking at trauma and recovery or experiencing disasters from more of a community-based perspective as opposed to the individual. What we have come to understand well in the disaster recovery space is that recovery does not necessarily mean a return to a pre-existing state, a state of prior health and functioning, or, for example, a community returning to the way it once was. And if you grab a dictionary and you look up the definition of recovery, what you will read is something along the lines of a return to a pre-existing state. But most or many community members will tell you, those who have had a first-hand disaster experience, they will explain that for many reasons, their community is always fundamentally different. And although some people's lives, will be impacted or affected less than others, many people's lives are profoundly different. We could even say, for example, that someone whose house is burnt in a bushfire and who goes through the rebuilding process, although they will have a house again, it will never be exactly the same home as what they had previously. And we'll touch on recovery a little bit further down the track. So what does all of this mean? Well, it means that the terms disaster and emergency can be used interchangeably. There's really only very subtle differences there. Very importantly, that the effects of a disaster, there are effects of disasters that occur on an individual level, but it's also very well understood that disasters are social events. Hence this focus or emphasis on the community aspect or community process. From a mental health perspective, there is a very clear diagnostic process that we can work through after exposure to a potentially traumatic event. And the aim of that is to determine the extent of the impact. So, for instance, after some natural disaster events, it has been practice on occasions for organisations to use screening tools, for example, with children to determine the level or the significance of traumatic impact. What I want to, I guess, a key message or take-home message here is that, of course, it's fundamentally important to have a good clinical skill set. But if you're working in the disaster recovery space, it's also really important to have an understanding of community process and of aspects of the phases of recovery. Then recovery is an ongoing process, well understood as occurring over years. It's not necessarily about a return to a pre-existing state, and it's not necessarily about achieving a measurable outcome. We might start to think and talk about recovery for community members as being regaining a life that has good meaning, good purpose, a return to enjoyable experiences, but it is probably going to be a different life in quite a few different respects or aspects.
David, just quickly before we move on, we had a question from Richard, and he was asking, so the community definition didn't include topographical specifications, and is there any reason for that?
No, that was just a definition that I took from a particular source. That's all.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. I'd like to also, just before I move on to the next section about having a look at protective factors, I just wanted to touch on briefly some key effects of natural disaster events. So these are the kinds of effects that we will typically outline to community at a community information session. So they are disruption, stress, loss, fatigue, and trauma. And this will probably make a lot more sense when I come to the last section and sort of wrap everything up in the community process framework or frame. So I think a starting point is to mention to you that normal or ordinary day-to-day life is relatively stable and predictable, so prior to a disaster or prior to a pandemic. And what we often talk about are constants or constancies as being really important aspects or elements of our life that contribute to that predictability and that certainty. So constants are those things that we take for granted, but that are embedded within the habits and the routines of our day-to-day life. So examples of constants are when you finish work, that you have a house or a home that you come back to, that in the home is your family, you know, they're there every evening. That's just hypothetically speaking, that across the course of the day, you travel to your job and you perform your work role. And then every couple of weeks, your employer pays you on a regular basis. And then the Australian Tax Department, even, they take a portion of your pay on a regular basis also. Now, these are all constants. And these constants, although initially we have to become, we are aware of them, as we are repetitively involved in them and repetitively perform them, they fade from our awareness and they sort of just sit there in the background. But they do play an important role in that they give us a sense of predictability and a sense of certainty. And in fact, what we could say is that constancies are founded upon assumptions, and in fact, assumptions about what is normal and what's expected in day-to-day life. And perhaps the biggest or the most significant constancy that we hold with us in our Western routinized way of living is that of safety and security. Now, what disaster events do, and in fact what COVID-19 has done significantly or caused to happen significantly, is it's caused disruption to pre-existing life constancies. And therefore the routines that bind life together in that stable, predictable way become influenced or upset, disrupted. Sometimes they're shattered when there's a really significant impact. And the result of this is at a minimum stress. But we know also anxiety can be a result. And when constancies are shattered, that's when we could be expecting that people are going to suffer some sort of traumatic impact. So that flows into the second point here, that stress is a key effect within communities impacted by disaster. And what we've also come to know and understand well is that protracted stress over an extended period of time takes its toll on people's health and functioning. And we will typically talk about survival mode or the adrenaline phase and endurance mode or the cortisol phase. Survival mode is what people go into and experience at the time of the event and in the days and weeks after. Cortisol or endurance mode is often what community members will go into and experience for the months and months and months and year and a half after the event, and is what enables them to be involved in and to keep facing and working through all of the challenges that come their way. However, it is also associated with a range of physical and mental health challenges. Loss is another key effect. And one of the reasons that we mention this is that there is quite a typical assumption that is made within community that loss, the amount of loss or significance of loss equates to material loss, but that's certainly not the case. We know that, of course, people can lose beautiful vistas or landscapes that they have a strong attachment to, or that neighbours can move away from an area. You might also, lose companion pets or animals as well. Then there's fatigue, and we know that communities can end up feeling incredibly fatigued. In fact, the information that's coming through now, and again, some of you or many of you may be coming into contact with this now also, that communities start to feel really quite fatigued across the course, across the course of recovery, but certainly by the end of the first year, people are typically starting to feel the tiredness underneath. And then there is trauma, which I've touched on already. I'll pause just there before moving on to the next section and sort of take any questions that have come through.
So David, we've had a couple just from that slide. So Antonetta asks, what was the survival mode associated with?
So survival mode, because this is a condensed webinar, what I haven't unpacked in detail are the stress states or the theory of stress. But from a community recovery perspective, what we often talk about are two states of stress. One is associated with survival mode, which is the adrenaline state of stress, and the other is associated with endurance mode, or the cortisol state of stress. So survival mode and adrenaline is associated with the body entering into a state of where it becomes specialized to face a threat, for example, a fire or a flood. However, ordinarily after the threat subsides, the body is able to return to a state of balance. The cortisol state of stress is cortisol is a stress hormone that gives people access to energy they wouldn't otherwise ordinarily get access to, and it enables people to sort of keep going when there are multiple challenges, hence the term endurance mode, or often we talk about running a marathon. Hopefully that answers that question.
Thanks, David. And there was one more. So Richard's asked again, so in terms of emotional loss, is that ultimately the most enduring during an emergency or disaster?
Yeah, I don't think we sort of have any information to say or to clarify which is the most enduring loss. The point actually that I didn't make in the prior slide when I was talking about loss is that what we do emphasize to communities is the importance of not making assumptions about other community members' losses, because we really can't know the extent or the impact of loss unless we talk to someone and really find out what their first-hand experience is. So a story that a colleague of mine shares is of presenting at a community information session or talking at a community information session, and in this session was a woman becoming sort of quite upset, and when he spoke to her at the end of that session, she made the comment that she really felt like she shouldn't be upset for her circumstances, and this was in a flood type situation somewhere in central Victoria, because her home had survived. And then when he spoke with her a little bit further, what became apparent was that, well, her block was flooded, and in fact there was a shed down at the bottom of the block that was inundated with water. And then when they spoke about what was in the shed, it became apparent that some very, very important sort of possessions that had been passed down through the family, I think family heirlooms were in that shed, and had all been destroyed and washed away. So she was suffering a really profound loss associated with, an attachment to those and really what they meant. And so we make this point that we can't necessarily equate loss with purely material loss, but as to what's the most enduring form of loss, I don't really think there's anything clear about that at the moment, or not that I'm aware of.
Thanks, David.
That's
there
okay.
weren't any other questions.
Okay, no worries. I'll move on to the next section. So this is a relatively brief section, and again, I'm not sort of sure entirely as to what people's pre-existing awareness, background or experiences are, but I wanted to just touch on both individual and community protective factors. So, I mean, just to set some context, we can say that any element, variable or factor that contributes to a reduced positive outcome in the context of individual mental health and well-being or community recovery is a risk factor. And therefore, a protective factor is something that has the opposite effect. It enhances the likelihood of a positive outcome. Now, we have this amazing institute called the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. And many years ago, I believe 15 years ago, they developed a framework of principles to guide community recovery. And they're called the National Principles of Disaster Recovery. They were updated just a couple of years ago, and approval came through for the update of those principles. But I think, and we could, not only do I think, but we can consider these to be community-based recovery protective factors. And in fact, these are a framework that is used to guide the community recovery process. So again, I bring this in because if you haven't worked in a disaster recovery setting, and perhaps you're just travelling to a community to work there, and then you leave at the end of the day or you leave at the end of the week, and that certainly happens relatively commonly, then you won't necessarily have a pre-existing understanding of the unique features of that community. And that actually is really important when we're working in the disaster recovery space. So, you know, these principles mention, for instance, that it's important to understand the context of the unique features of the impacted community. So whenever we go out to work with the community or prior to a community information or recovery session, for example, we will always spend some time talking to those that are in emergency management or psychosocial recovery roles working in the community, but also, and ideally, talk to some long-standing community members to get an understanding of what their community's key features were like prior to the event, and also what key features of the community are like now after the event. I mean, I'll also add, it's also really important, if you can, to build and to develop an understanding of the unique features of the disaster itself. So if we're talking about a bushfire, was it a slow-moving bushfire that, you know, people therefore had a relatively good amount of warning for, or was that in fact not the case at all? Or did the fire come through in the middle of the night? Or how intense was the fire? Or how long did the Amber attack last for? Was that a lot longer than ordinary? And, you know, so therefore these are really important features which, if you can be aware of them when you're then working one-on-one with people, and as they start to tell their story and unpack their experience, you'll be able to understand it better and relate to it better. The second principle, though, in this framework is to recognise the complexity and the dynamic nature of emergencies and their impact over time. And I think, again, this will, you know, become a little bit clearer in the last session, where I just show you a couple of diagrams relating to phases of the recovery cycle. But that emphasises that there are these sort of common themes that occur across the course of the recovery process. So initially people will be really quite bonded together and quite positive. However, after a few months, or maybe by the 6-month mark, that positivity might be starting to, you know, the sort of the survival, the fact that we've survived together and the altruism and we're all in this together might be starting to, or often is, wearing a little bit thin as people start to tire and feel fatigued. And then we know there's the end of the first year and the first summer and the first anniversary, and then into the second year, and there are these myriad of different experiences that people go through and that communities have. So it's also important, where you can, to be aware of that. Again, it will help when you come into contact with individuals. Thirdly, using community-led approaches that are flexible, engaging and empowering. So really gone are the days a long time ago, hopefully, where organisations or agencies would come in and just tell communities the way they should recover or how it was going to go. The focus really is these days to listen to community, understand their needs, and join with them in their recovery journey and process. Fourthly, ensuring coordination of all activities that is also adaptive and uses ongoing assessment to determine needs. Fifthly, employing effective communication with communities and stakeholders, e.g. relevant, timely, clear, credible and targeted. And, you know, I will just also make the point that communication is the concrete tool that we have to work with in a disaster recovery space. And there is absolutely the work that you do in a clinical and a therapeutic setting, but in that sort of community framework, communication also plays a very important role. So what we also tend to mention and say is that the pre-existing community networks are incredibly important to become aware of, because they are what can be used to transmit information through a community. So information about, for example, clinical or counselling services, or information about community recovery sessions, or information, wide ranges of information. And sixthly, acknowledging and building capacity by recognising and supporting, as well as identifying gaps in existing capability. Now, that's probably not going to be so relevant for those of you in clinical roles, although having said that, you might be able to recognise and identify that in fact there are services that are lacking or missing, that if they can be brought into the community will provide help and benefit. Now, individual protective factors. So I think it's also important to say that the statistics tell us quite clearly that the majority of people, so very well, I'll say roughly approximately 80% of people who experience a disaster do recover without needing to access formal clinical or support services. And it's the smaller proportion of people that will need that more formal assistance. Although, having said that, it does depend on the nature of the event. But, you know, that's approximately about what it is. Individual protective factors are those that assist in promoting recovery and mental health. So they include, and these have been identified and taken from the emergency management, psychosocial recovery and trauma recovery space. Firstly, having a sense of safety, which makes sense. People who feel safer are more likely to recover. And if I bring in here some psychosocial recovery language, or even if you think about or have some awareness of psychological first aid, an early intervention technique, which in fact I'll talk to you about in just a moment, you'd be aware that one of the first things we're working to do is help people feel safe again, because people can't really begin that process of recovery until the heightened state of stress begins to reduce. So this then flows nicely into reducing arousal and calming. So after the threat, deactivation of the body's survival response by promoting calming. So that is that adrenaline mode, that survival mode, assisting people to come out of that. And it's not at all unusual to be meeting with people again in a counselling or clinical setting some months down the track, and they are still in a highly elevated and stressed state, you know, and have never ever talked about their survival experience, or bushfire or flood experience. And, you know, quite frequently it will be that first session and the second session quite potentially is that they will just talk a lot about what they went through, and you can really see and sense the heightened state of stress in them. Thirdly, we know that people who have an increased sense of control or efficacy are more likely to recover better. And efficacy is a view or a belief, or we might say a perspective, that I have the skills and the abilities to work through and overcome current challenges. Fourthly, we know that a more hopeful and optimistic perspective or outlook assists and supports recovery. And I'm sure many of you would recognise that social support is a well-identified protective factor. And then sixthly, that reducing secondary stresses. So this is the kind of the everything else category that would include such things as financial stresses, relationship stresses, employment stresses, etc., replacing destroyed documents, these are secondary stresses that can additionally impact people, and whenever they can be resolved or reduced, that will ordinarily be helpful for community members also. So practical implications, bearing in mind, community and individual protective factors. What I'd suggest is take the time to get to know and to understand the unique features of the community that you're working in. That is, of course, if you don't already live and work in that community. Then secondly, really work to develop relationships with pre-existing community services. And then when there are, for example, community information and recovery sessions, or other sessions or services or community-based activities taking place, get yourself along to them, as best you can. Not necessarily all of them, but certainly it will give you a capacity, will give you an insight and an awareness into the community's experiences. So if I think back to last year, even earlier this year, in visiting New South Wales after the East Coast bushfires, it's quite typical for New South Wales to run community information sessions where there's a community barbecue, and then someone comes along from the community who's a well-identified member, and they will talk briefly about available services. And then maybe someone else presents, but then at the end there's an opportunity for people to mingle and talk, and it's that sort of session. If you're there, community members will start to open up. We'll talk about challenges and difficulties, and you can start to then recognise some of those unique features in that particular community. And then fifthly, of course, promoting support services that strengthen individual protective factors. Perhaps I'll pause briefly before talking about and looking at early intervention strategies.
Yeah, thanks, David. So we had a few comments and a question come through. I think one of the comments that I wanted to flag from Richard is the fact that he was mentioning specifically in Kangaroo Island, but I think it's applicable quite broadly, the fact that service providers are also can be victims or impacted by the disasters themselves.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
And
yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, and just to say, so they will of course have a good understanding of their community, but they will often be carrying a load associated with their own experience, their own disaster experience.
And I guess on from that, one of Richard's questions was, how much do you find the triggers from events such as anniversaries, reunions, and therapeutic encounters reactivating some of the stress that was and is experienced through these emergencies?
Well, certainly anniversaries. So the first anniversary of the date, or the first bushfire, and there are other, I guess, key anniversaries that can occur within a community. Absolutely, they can absolutely be triggers and activate people. What we're always working to do, well, in a community recovery perspective or setting, is be aware of those anniversaries and of the fact that they're coming up, and work with community to help them prepare for them and be able to best support each other during events like that. There was a huge amount of work that went into preparing for the 10-year anniversary of the 2009 Victorian bushfires. And then in a clinical setting, of course, we should always work to remain mindful and aware of what important dates are applicable for a person, and maintain an awareness of them and when they're coming up, and work with the client to prepare also.
Thanks, David. There were no other questions at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that. So I want to touch on now, so having set this context for disasters, emergencies and recovery, and then having provided this brief outline of community protective factors and individual protective factors, it's important to have a look at early intervention strategies. And I guess an entry point into this would be to say, and I say this cautiously again because I don't know what everybody's background is, but if we haven't worked in a disaster recovery setting, then we will be coming at this work and working with community members from probably a purely clinical and therapeutic perspective. But in disaster recovery, there are specific techniques and approaches that have been developed and defined and tested to a certain extent over time that are now, I guess, part of standard practice, we could say, and commonly used in the early aftermath of an event. So I want to create a context for those, and then that will sort of flow on and link nicely to clinical intervention strategies. So I've mentioned already, and you've heard me say, that psychosocial recovery after disaster takes place over years, and that there are these identifiable phases or stages of recovery that exist alongside, well, you haven't heard me say this, but I'll highlight it to you shortly, different pathways of responding. So if I just move forward here, yes, this is one of the diagrams that I wanted to show you, phases of the recovery cycle. And you can see along the bottom there, a time frame initially starts off in days, but sort of spreads out to years. And we know and recognise well that initially there are these positive feelings of altruism, heroic search and rescue efforts, this sense of having shared survival, that we can get through this together. So the heroic flows into the honeymoon period. And this, I think, diagram has been put together and adapted over time by a number of key community members in Australia who have first-hand experiences of disaster. But we can see that the process really starts to change, or people's and communities' experiences really start to change, and they'll come into contact with different sorts of challenges. You know, it will start to become apparent to them as to whether they have enough insurance or not, you know, or are they insured at all? Do they qualify for grants, for example? What's their BAL rating going to come back at, and that will influence the building and recovery process? Or are they going to be able to adjust their cattle for longer? And there's a whole series of things that can influence this process, and you can start to see that it begins to become a bit of a roller coaster with emotions such as anger, frustration and disappointment coming in. And, you know, communities will often say that they feel very forgotten. You know, they feel like support has been withdrawn. And, you know, towards the end of the first year, you know, they'll really start to feel like others have lost track of or lost contact with what they're going through. And then you can see exhaustion, groups weaken, fragment, delays, obstacles. But there is another side to this, and in fact, some of the work that we're involved in at the moment with Victoria's fire-affected Gippsland area and school communities, we have a couple of people who have first-hand fire experiences, and they're sharing with these communities and talking very openly about the role, their roller coaster ride, and that there were immense challenges. But then in the end, they were able to get through, and there were often new dimensions or elements that came into their life that provided some benefit across the course of the recovery cycle. So forming new meaningful friendships, for instance, is an example of that. I wanted to just also highlight too, before we look at the early intervention strategies, I just wanted to highlight as well, that it's, again, not as simple as people are either affected or not affected, or people recover or they don't recover. In fact, there are some well-identified trajectories of recovery across the durational period of time. And this particular diagram here comes from the Australian Centre for Post-Traumatic Mental Health, where a number of different pathways following adversity or trauma have been identified. And sort of the context and the background to this really goes back to the 1970s, when children in America were growing up in incredibly difficult backgrounds, exposed to domestic violence, substance use, trauma. And the researchers at the time were working to identify predictors of the development of mental health challenges later on in life. And sort of interestingly, and almost to their surprise, they found that there was a group of children, about 20%, who in fact, went on to become and to live incredibly well-balanced, healthy, meaningful, functional lives. And subsequently, over a series of studies afterwards, for example, with adults who had lost a partner midlife, then following the 9/11 Twin Tower emergency or disaster there, similar sorts of findings were found. That is, that there was always a group that didn't seem to be too significantly negatively impacted or affected. And so you can see in this diagram here that there's what we call, or what's been identified as, the chronic pathway. So these are people who unfortunately do experience significant impact or effect, become unwell and remain unwell for quite a period of time. There's what's been identified here as the resilient pathway. There is an impact and effect, but they regain an ability to function. There's a delayed pathway, people that appear to be going along quite well, and then their health and well-being deteriorates after a period of time. And we know that we definitely see this pathway in communities affected by natural disaster, people who appear to be going quite well for the first year, but then start to run very low on energy or run out of energy, and they sort of become more susceptible to becoming unwell. And then you can see this resistant pathway, almost non-affected, and then a growth pathway. And some of you may have heard of post-traumatic growth, or vicarious post-traumatic growth for that matter, but post-traumatic growth would be most relevant in this setting. So people that actually, as a result of their exposure to trauma, grow and develop positively. Now, in terms of early intervention, and following the 2009 Victorian bushfires, the stepped care or 3-tiered model was developed, and the stepped care model is actually is still used today, or is very much still used today. And you'll see in the next section when I talk about or outline to you the most recent guidelines for the treatment of traumatic stress injuries, that the stepped care approach is very much still recommended. So there are 3 levels: level 1, level 2, and level 3. And level 1 relates to techniques or approaches used in the immediate aftermath of an event. So, for example, psychological first aid. Level 2 relates to those techniques or approaches used from the first month after an event and for some months or a period of time afterwards. There's a program called SOLAR, and then there are support groups. And then level 3, which is from 1 month after an event, but this is these are the more clinical and treatment-focused interventions or approaches for the people that we know are now fitting a diagnosis. I've mentioned here as well, and/or pharmacological treatment or intervention as well. So here's a diagram just representing these 3 different levels. So level 1, simple, practical, emotional, informational support. Actually, what I should mention is that just going back to that 80%, 20%, 80% of people recover without formal intervention. About 20% of people don't. What occurred in the late 1990s and early 2000s was a very clear recognition of this fact, and a real movement away from the focus, or what had been the dominant perspective, that if people are exposed to trauma, they're going to need to be treated to recover. Instead, what formed was this view that, well, no, what we need to do is just to support and assist people so that they can best draw on their own sort of internal resilient capabilities and capacities and heal and recover of their own accord. And then if they don't, and this would be at the 1 or 2 month mark approximately, then we'd be looking at referring them on to formal treatment or clinical assistance. And I'll talk about what SOLAR is shortly. So psychological first aid, and I just already started to talk about that shifting perspective or focus in the early 1990s and in the late 1990s, and the development of psychological first aid was really, in the end, the result of that. So it's a technique or an approach that aims to protect and support people through the acute phase of disaster and early aftermath. It's not as such a clinical intervention. You don't need to be a health professional or a health professional to be trained in it. And in fact, in Victoria, if we look at Red Cross's volunteers and the Victorian Council of Churches volunteers, most people are not health professionals. They're people that want to genuinely assist and support community members affected by disaster, and they're able to undertake a 1 or 2 day training program in PFA, and then are able to, be dispatched to a disaster affected area when and if there's a need. Now, the thing is, well, I have to mention that PFA is not an evidence-based intervention because it's incredibly difficult, you can imagine, to rigorously research effectiveness in a disaster setting, pre and post, and expose some people to PFA and not others and then compare. But it is what we say an evidence-informed intervention and approach. And although many of the organisations that provide PFA training, although there are many organisations that provide PFA training, there isn't in actual fact one main PFA training approach. In fact, there are what I would say are common themes or common elements amongst the different trainings that are provided. And they are to promote safety, so that involves reducing exposure to threat, ensure basic needs are met. So I probably need to paint a picture here for some of you that if we take the Burke Street tragedy in Melbourne a number of years ago, for example, within just a few hours, so later that day, and then for about 4 to 6 weeks afterwards, both the Red Cross and the Victorian Council of Churches dispatched volunteers to provide PFA in Melbourne CBD. And so there were PFA providers sort of standing at main streets where that particular tragedy had occurred and at other predetermined spots throughout the city. And they were, their aim was to be very visible and to be available to assist and support community members. So if you had been there on the day, or even if you hadn't been, but this particular event was having some sort of impact and effect on you, you could walk up to one of these PFA providers and seek their support and assistance. So just trying to paint a bit of a picture and a context there. So PFA aims to promote safety, to promote calm by establishing a supportive human connection, listening, providing information, helping to reduce the heightened state of stress. Thirdly, promoting connectedness, so helping survivors to re-establish contact with family and friends if needed. And also, and importantly, enrolling people into recovery-related support. So if I make a transition to bushfire recovery, and point out that bushfire experiences, well, although it's becoming a little bit more common actually that people have more than one bushfire experience in their life, most people still don't. They haven't previously had one when they do experience one. And so we also can't work on the assumption that community members in general know and understand well that there's an entire psychosocial recovery system and series of services set up in every state designed to help people in the aftermath of an event, and for some months and quite frequently for some years afterwards. They don't have any pre-existing awareness of that. And so PFA then becomes a way to link people to recovery-related supports if there's a need. It also aims to promote self-efficacy through a collaborative approach, and it really works to promote hope as well by building a framework of understanding through information, so instilling hope and optimism. So hopefully you're getting the picture, and hopefully also some of you, have some sort of prior awareness of PFA or of the organisations that provide PFA. Now, in the early following the 2009 Victorian bushfires, something called Skills for Psychological Recovery was developed, SPR, and that was, if you think back to that three-level tiered approach, was a second level tier intervention, which was designed to be provided by healthcare professionals, but it wasn't clinical intervention as such. It wasn't treatment for example, post-traumatic stress disorder. It was still a manualized approach. You had to go and participate in a day or 2 days training, I think, of it. But for example, if it was 6 weeks, 7 weeks after the bushfires and you were working with a client or a person who still had high levels of stress and anxiety and was experiencing difficulty sleeping, then SPR was this manualized approach that contained a whole series of resources that could be given to a person about heightened stress, about sleep difficulties, and there were suggestions made and techniques and strategies that people could use to try and work through that particular challenge. The reason I mention SPR is that the SOLAR program, which has been developed within the last 12 months or so by Phoenix Australia, is an update of SPR. SPR in origin comes from the United States or from America, and so is therefore never entirely suited to the Australian demographic, whereas SOLAR has been developed specifically for the Australian demographic. So it's a brief 5-session program for people, and probably, and my understanding is that Phoenix is working towards a point where people can be trained in SOLAR, you know, perhaps in preparation for the upcoming fire season in Australia. And then I thought it important to also mention support groups as playing an important role in early intervention or in the early intervention space, because I've seen them occur in so many different communities over time, and they provide really an incredible amount of benefit, both in the early aftermath, but also across the duration of recovery. And so we know, for example, that the Australian Centre for Grief and Bereavement was involved in setting up support groups following the 2009 fires, but there were also many other types of groups that formed. And over the years, I've come across quite a few individuals who, when those groups sort of formally came to an end, for example, in regard to grief and loss, they continued on in a more informal format. And community members sort of tend to and ordinarily derive a lot of benefit from that ongoing support. And, you know, over time, friendships build and strengthen, which is, you know, we know and understand to be a really integral and important part of that recovery journey and working through the aftermath of a disaster. So I'll pause there now at the end of that section and take any questions or queries.
Thanks, David. So there's one at the moment, and we'll see if any more come through. But Richard was wondering, so in reference to the prototypical recovery trajectories of an individual, so he's wondering if they're essentially global personality characteristics, or if they have anything to do with that.
Again, I haven't seen any clear research or evidence that shows that's the case. I mean, I think I could only say in my own clinical work that, you know, I definitely recognise particular personality structures, you know, and/or characteristics and traits as either contributing to better recovery or hindering the recovery process.
Thanks, David.
Yeah.
So Richard's followed up. So then what differentiates who follows the different courses?
Yeah, I couldn't unpack that either. It'd probably just be best, I think, to you know, perhaps direct him to some of the references that explore this in more detail, because these sorts of pathways are also very much related to the sample that has been studied at the time and the event as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll see if there are any follow-up materials that we have around that we can share.
Yeah, sure.
And yeah, Richard, that would be good if you can send the recovery@redcross.org.au. We can see if we can follow up with anything. So David, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, no worries. Yep. Thank you. All right, so moving on to and having a look at clinical intervention strategies. Get my slides to work. So I've Again, there are, of course, a plethora of intervention strategies that we could explore and look at, but we're on time limitations here. So what I decided would probably be most helpful and useful for you would be to provide an overview of some very recently released guidelines, and in fact guidelines for the prevention and treatment of acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder and complex PTSD, which have been developed by Phoenix Australia. So there is therefore, of course, this trauma focus, but I really wanted to point out and mention it's of course fundamentally important to acknowledge that trauma is not the only mental health condition that can develop as a result of exposure to a natural disaster, but depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, sleep disorders, substance dependence, etc. All of which have their own recommended and evidence-based treatment approaches. I've made that point again, though, that the majority of community members are able to recover without formal intervention and support. So in these particular guidelines, the way recommendations have been outlined, well, firstly, the demographics that are considered are children, adolescents, and adults. And then treatment approaches or interventions are categorised under the following headings. Either there's a strong recommendation for their use, or a conditional recommendation for their use, or a strong recommendation against their use, or a conditional recommendation against their use, and then a recommendation for further research. And so there's 6 combinations there, I think, or 6 headings. And again, I'm not going to look at each of those. I've just picked out what I think, would probably be of interest for people and of helpful for people. But also want to note that in those guidelines, it is mentioned that they're not to be regarded as an inflexible prescription for the content or delivery of treatment, that they're to be interpreted and implemented in the context of good clinical judgment and not just rigid rules. So for children and adolescents, psychological treatments with a strong recommendation for use. In fact, there are just 2 in those guidelines. So strong recommendation for use with clinically relevant post-traumatic stress symptoms. 2 treatments, 1 trauma-focused CBT for children and trauma-focused CBT for caregiver and child. And again, I'm not unpacking these treatments in intricate detail because there isn't time, but I have included at the end of this webinar a reference list, and you can certainly go to Phoenix's site, access these guidelines and read through and look at a more detailed explanation as to what each of these treatments involves. But trauma-focused CBT for children, 6 to 12 sessions, various components, across the course of those sessions, but overall the description is that it involves coming to terms with the trauma through exposure to and emotional processing of memories of the event. And then trauma-focused CBT for caregiver and child, interestingly, involves inclusion of parents or caregivers throughout the treatment process. Now, for adults, early, that is within the first 3 months, psychological interventions for adults with a strong recommendation for use. So 1, that stepped collaborative care approach, which I spoke about in the previous section, so the tiered approach. And this has embedded within it also, as I've mentioned, the recognition that not everyone exposed to trauma develops a diagnosis, that there's the existence of threshold symptoms, and therefore there's a need to assess and also to monitor, and then there's that point or the cut-off point where the referral to more formal clinical or treatment services can be made if necessary. Also early, and therefore within the first 3 months, clinical interventions for adults with conditional recommendation for use. Just 5, trauma-focused CBT, cognitive therapy, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, and then brief EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. Now, psychological interventions with a strong recommendation for use in adults with clinically relevant post-traumatic stress symptoms. So this is post 3 months. 6, I think, 5. Sorry there, everyone, for changing those slides. So cognitive processing therapy, CPT, a 12-session manualized approach to treatment and a form of cognitive therapy refined specifically for the treatment of PTSD. Cognitive therapy, a variation of trauma-focused CBT in which the clinicians and client develop an individualized version of Ehlers and Clark's model of PTSD, and there's a description of what that is in the guidelines. Eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or EMDR, which they have described as an 8-phase trauma-focused therapy involving the use of bilateral physical stimulation, so for example eye movements, but also of taps or tones, although I have to say eye movements is what I've also always been most familiar with. Fourthly, prolonged exposure, and then fifthly, trauma-focused CBT. So perhaps I'll just let you read through those descriptions as well. And I've made this the comment or the point at the end of this sectional presentation that also, as many of you will be aware, and or are required to do or and are mandated to do, it's really important to be involved in continuing professional development, across the course of your work, and to have good peer and clinical and professional supports in place. Other points of interest, as far as pharmacological treatments go, so they list in these guidelines or mention in these guidelines conditional recommendation for the use of selective reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, and give the examples of fluoxetine, paroxetine, and sertraline. And then for an SNRI, venlafaxine. That's all that's listed there. So I know whenever I come across clients that have a PTSD diagnosis, I'm always having a look at which medications they're on, and whether they're in line with those that are recommended or are identified as having a conditional recommendation for use. Interestingly, and I hadn't come across this before until these guidelines were released, further research is recommended for the use of ketamine or quetiapine, quetiapine being an antipsychotic. And then there's a great long list of further research being required for acupuncture, mindfulness-based stress reduction, neurofeedback, physical exercise, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, transcendental meditation, and yoga. And we'll often see these various therapies and treatments come into a community or be recommended in a community, but of course as a health professional it's just important to hold an awareness as to which ones have evidence behind them and which ones don't. Someone asked the question there about what an SNRI is. An SNRI is a serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. So it's an antidepressant that works on a slightly different pathway in the body. I thought also just to paint a brief picture to you before we sort of try to wrap this all up in community process, just paint a brief picture and provide a context about where mental illness is in Australia prior to anything like a natural disaster or COVID-19 occurring, and then just highlight to you some of the findings that have already started to emerge, although this is in Victoria, as a result of COVID-19. So that is the significant impact on people's general health and well-being and also their mental health. So we know that ordinarily the statistics or the estimates are something like this, that about 17% of the working population has a mental illness, a diagnosable mental health condition, that depression and anxiety are the most common issues. And then there's an additional just under 20% of people who have subclinical symptoms. So these are people that don't fit a diagnosis, but for example, they have symptoms of anxiety or symptoms of depression. About 4.5% of the population have a diagnosis of PTSD. And then 1 in 10 Australians have a diagnosable sleep disorder, with, by the way, another 2 in 10 having a sleep problem. And then in regards to alcohol use, 1 in 5 Australians are deemed to be drinking at a high risk level. Now, these figures that I've mentioned here, you know, I know many of you are working in bushfire affected areas, but of course we have COVID-19 as an overlay across everything at the moment. Of course, Victoria experiencing incredibly challenging times, and New South Wales just, I think, working to hold on to the situation at the moment. And of course, we've become aware of what's just started to unfold in New Zealand over the last few days. Last Sunday at the Victorian Premier Dan Andrews press conference, the following figures were released. So that there has been in Victoria a 33% increase in young people presenting to emergency departments for issues of self-harm over the last 6 weeks in comparison to the same time last year in 2019. That there's been a 10% overall rise in presentations to ED for self-harm for the general population, that there has, for the same, in comparison to the same time last year and over the last 6 weeks, 11% increase in people contacting services for inpatient program care or residential care, again compared to the same time last year. 30% increase in telehealth mental support, and a significant increase in new mental health presentations. And that was defined as people who have not presented for formal mental health assistance or support at all in the last 5 years. So that to me paints a very clear picture of the significant impact of COVID. And if we think about some of those protective factors that I touched on earlier in the session, social connection, involvement in positive networks and supports, well, we know that COVID-19 has caused significant disruption and is also restricting access to pre-existing networks and supports. And, you know, I just encourage you to think, if you're working with a disaster affected community, you know, what the compounding effect might be. Also taking into consideration that some, if not many, of the bushfire affected communities at this point in time had also been experiencing drought for an extended period prior. So I'll just pause there. Again, take any questions before we then move on to the final section.
There don't seem to be any questions as yet.
Okay, sure. All right, so I'll move on to this last section where I said I wanted to try and wrap everything up in some issues that, well, I wanted to try and wrap this up in the community recovery framework. So we started off just briefly having a look at disasters, emergencies and recovery. I then outlined and spoke about both community and individual protective factors. And I guess within all of that, I was really working to highlight and emphasize that there is the real importance of working with people individually, but if we're working in a disaster setting, we can't be doing that in well, I would suggest that we shouldn't be doing that in isolation from holding and building and developing an awareness of the community in which we're working, because community or individual experiences as a result of disaster, you know, very much occur in unison with or as a part of community process. I then touched on and outlined some early intervention strategies, and then just gave you a very brief overview of trauma-focused clinical intervention approaches. Now, I think right at the beginning of the presentation, I spoke about constancies or constants, and they're actually quite a good entry into this section, the normal 3D world. And so that is that we could start to think about our world as being comprised of society, community, and personal networks, with each of those having particular or key features. And then there are these psychosocial constancies, that is, those assumptions about what is normal and what is to be expected in day-to-day life that underpins everything and works to create a sense of predictability and certainty in our lives. And then I think I made the comment that perhaps the greatest constancy in our Western routinized way of living is that of safety and security. So therefore, when the disaster occurs, constancies are disrupted, and they can in fact be shattered quite significantly. There are some key terms that I want to mention to you that have been being used for some time to help communities and also those working in the community recovery space understand the phases of recovery. Now, I know I showed you one diagram earlier on. That was sort of the diagram that went like this. It started off with heroic and then honeymoon, and then there was the dip down and up. That's one perspective of the phases. Another is this one, which I'm just going to briefly paint a picture of, and I have to say that ordinarily there would be about half a day spent in a training session unpacking this, so I really am giving you the brief overview and the whirlwind tour. But what I want to mention to you is, or key phrases would be, that there is the threat of the event, the occurrence of the event itself. There's then typically what we refer to as a debonding process. There's then something that we refer to as fusion, and there is both positive fusion and negative fusion. Then we typically see the development of cleavage planes, but what we're aiming for with community is coordinated differentiation. So the diagram that you see on the screen now is working to represent a pre-disaster community structure where the different coloured dots, each dot, roughly, use your imagination here, represents a person, and each collection or grouping of dots represents a subgroup within a broader community. So we're looking here at one large rural community, let's say that, and within that large rural community, or that small rural community for that matter, are a series of smaller subgroupings. So the blues might represent parents whose children all go to the same primary school or the same Peter 12 school. The reds might represent the local CFA or RFS members, and the yellows and the greens, they have a belonging to another subgroup within the community. And what you can also, of course, have is a belonging to more than one subgroup within a community also. But the point here being that this is a relatively stable, uniform structure, and then you can see the grey lines, or I'd refer to them as bonds, that are attaching individual members. And if we were having this session face to face and could have some more spontaneous conversation, I would start asking you, what do you think those grey lines or those bonds are made out of? What's the material base of them? And what we would get to eventually is that those bonds are made out of or are represented in communication. That is, how are relationships formed? How are they maintained and strengthened over time? Well, generally through communication. And the reason that we mention this, and I did make this comment earlier on also, is that communication is the concrete tool that we have to work with. But I want to show you now how things change as the disaster approaches, and also in the period of time afterwards. One way to do that is to, I guess, paint a bit more, give you a clearer insight by playing to you this particular YouTube clip, which comes from about 2011, I think February 2011, after one of the Christchurch earthquakes, which I think began in, I think they began in November, but this clip is just 3 or so minutes long. What you're going to see, it cuts in just after one of the earthquakes. There are 2 men standing in a building. They're looking out of the first floor window, the streetscape below them. What I would then just sort of ask you and encourage you to do is to just watch and observe and listen also. And then when we come back together as a group at the end of the clip, I'll use the clip to sort of highlight some of those key terms that I mentioned to you, the event, debonding, fusion, etc. And then I'll just work my way through the rest of the content. So yeah, if you could play that clip now, that would be really good. Got no sound, I think. No sound at all at the moment. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh shit. Oh, that was bad. Let's guess. Oh gosh. Oh my gosh. Are there people in there? I don't know. Are there people in there? Fuck. It's still coming. Oh my gosh.
All right, thanks for that. Thank you. So, when I get this slide working, all right. So thanks for watching through that. Probably didn't come out quite as clearly as I'd hoped or as ordinarily would, but that's, I guess, what we just have to adapt to when we're working under these circumstances. But what you could see there were two men who had just experienced one of the earthquakes in Christchurch, looking out at the streetscape beneath them. And I don't know if it came through very clearly, but actually in that clip, when the footage first comes in, there's complete silence. There's absolutely no communication between them at all. And if you think back to the diagram that I showed you just a moment ago with the dots, and I think I've got some more coming to show you and to illustrate this, it's as if those grey lines of communication have completely disappeared, because in fact you see when they get down onto the street, there are the workmen just milling around. No one is really communicating or talking with anyone at all. And in fact, these two men sort of stumble out onto the street, you know, drop the F-bomb a couple of times, don't say anything, walk up the street. One of them hears a burst gas pipe and he hears a gas leak. And then he says, oh, we're out of here. And he runs up the street again. So first point to make to you is that the nature of communication in that pre-existing community structure has changed entirely. And in fact, the bonds between people that ordinarily exist in that stable community structure have also changed entirely. Everybody is in a state, really that survival mode, a specialized state designed to deal with a physical crisis. I don't think it came through very clearly in the clip either, but once he turns around in that building and starts to make his way towards the stairwell, you can actually hear him start breathing very heavily. And this is, further activation of that survival mode. And he starts to take some very, very deep breaths as he's making his way down the stairwell and then onto the street. And then, as I mentioned, when he hears the gas leak, he gets activated again, and then he takes off running down the street. He then makes his way toward the end of the street where there's the upturned dome from what was a very famous landmark building in Christchurch. And he looks up onto the rubble and he sees a woman standing there, and he says to her, "Is there anyone in there? Is there anyone in there?" And she says she doesn't know, and you hear him drop the F-bomb again. And, we don't see it here, but I make up an ending to the clip because it's an ending that ordinarily happens in disaster situations. And that would be that he then gets up onto the rubble spontaneously. And think back to the first diagram I showed you of the phases of recovery with the heroic search and rescue efforts, which comes before the honeymoon phase. And that he then, in this highly stressed sort of adrenalized state, starts working with her to search for survivors. And in fact, what could have happened, because it does happen, is he could have done that for days, he could have done that for some weeks. Now, we then probably would have had, or certainly these days, we would have had some emergency evacuation centres being set up throughout the city, and we would have had the provision of PFA occurring. And we would start to work our way into, that recovery cycle, but this would be the very, very early phase. So just on that, we can say that the features of an emergency typically are that there's a threat to life and property, survival's brought into question, there's disruption to community function and communication, and the normal bonds and routines that ordinarily are there to support a safe, predictable life aren't there. They drop away. They're not adapted to deal with survival threats. So that normal community structure has to be dispensed with, and a new temporary structure comes into place. It's an improvised structure. So COVID-19, and I was using this slide during the first lockdown as the situation was unfolding in America. This slide and these pictures show how dramatic the change to pre-existing community functioning in normal life was once the virus hit New York. Vacant streets, refrigerated trucks for bodies for the deceased, the fumigation of a hotel car park, and a very, very tired, if not perhaps emotional, frontline health worker. So again, just emphasising the point that this pre-existing community structure changes. And, again, bring all of this into it because it is important to have this sort of overlay and begin to develop this awareness and understanding as you work in and go to work in a disaster-affected area. So this is going back to the diagram with the dots and the disaster impact, the threat emerging, and those grey lines have now disappeared. The communication has changed. People are not standing around talking about the footy match or the shopping or what they're going to be doing next week. People are now starting to orient themselves to face the threat. And then there is this phase or this stage that we recognise and understand well, where people become united in the event itself. So if we just think back to that Christchurch earthquake, and the guy who walked up to the woman standing on the rubble and asked her, "Is there anybody in there?" It really doesn't matter if she's a nurse and he works at the local supermarket. It doesn't matter what their pre-existing professional role or their status or their class is at all. They are just in this moment together. And so they have dropped out of their pre-existing community subgroup belonging, or their identity. Their identity now is as survivors, and the term fusion is referring to the way in which community members fuse together positively in the aftermath of the event. Everybody comes together. Just yesterday I heard some research being shared in the context of or in regard to COVID-19 in Melbourne, And this was actually research coming from some political analysts who were explaining that during the first lockdown, the cause of people's key concern was financial impact. During this second lockdown, stage 4 and stage 3, the key cause of people's concern is the threat of the virus. But what they've made mention of, and they were really surprised by it, although it makes complete sense to us who are familiar with these phases and these stages, is that there's been this real sense of human connectedness and this sense of, that we're all in this together. We want the government and the agencies to succeed in overcoming COVID. And that represents fusion. But then what they also went on to mention as well is that they were starting to notice in focus groups just across the course of the last week or two that the edge of the positivity is starting to break down. People are starting to tire. They're becoming more anxious and uncertain about the future and what it's going to hold. And this represents negative fusion and the potential of cleavage planes. So this next diagram here shows some of these grey lines of communication starting to reform. So that's like the guy talking to the woman on the rubble. Is there anyone in there? Is there anyone in there? And they could have started working together and then recruiting passers-by to come and help them. So everyone becomes oriented to the immediate needs in the aftermath of the event, and they don't stand around and wait for authorities to appear. So social debonding represents or is these constancies that I've mentioned, as well as values and norms being upturned. And there's this huge amount of disruption that I've spoken about. This, of course, then affects what's taken for granted. And what's important to say is that there isn't an immediate or an automatic return to the pre-existing community state or structure once the threat is gone. And maybe then the link I could draw here or bring you back to is that recovery is not necessarily a return to a pre-existing state. Things tend to always be different in some way. So the fusion state tends to be positive very early on. And here's some more pictures to represent that. I was using these during the first lockdown, so in about April of this year, as COVID emerged around the world. And top left here is Melbourne members of the Melbourne Sikh community, preparing to drop food voluntarily to members of their community. The bottom left-hand diagram here, someone also preparing for a food drop. And then on the right-hand side here, volunteers in the UK who have been making and preparing food for frontline hospital staff. So this is positive fusion. We're in this together to face the threat. However, the fusion state tends to break down and become a bit negative later on as people tire and fatigue and as different points of view emerge. And so this is where there's a risk to the integrity of a community and there's a risk to the recovery process becoming derailed. So, features of the negative fusive state in a community are that the myths and the rumours start to flourish. There's a tendency towards stereotypic thinking. There can be very simple ideas or views of impact and quite judgmental and critical attitudes and perspectives. And this is the entry into that in COVID around the world also a couple of months ago as protests started to emerge. People having different views about how to respond to the virus. But I just bring this into it because, of course, COVID is a significant event at the moment, but negative fusion and cleavages also appear in bushfire affected communities too. That might be about where to rebuild a neighbourhood house, for example, or that might be between two neighbours. One wants to put a fence in a particular place and the other doesn't. So without going into too much detail, negative fusion can lead into cleavage planes. Cleavage planes can derail the recovery process for a community if they become too big, too significant, and if people can't resolve their differences. So what we're always working to do is to identify any pre-existing cleavages that were in a community prior to an event, and then identify them ahead of time after the event or as they're emerging, and then work to suture them, you could say. So this diagram representing the emergence of cleavages in a community. You should also mention you can't see me pointing here, but the black perimeter around these diagrams, represents how communities will tend to form, disaster-affected communities will tend to form a perimeter around themselves. And you either went through the event with them or you didn't. And if you didn't, you'll probably be viewed as an outsider. And from a healthcare provider's perspective, if you're not one of those people with lived experience or from the community previously, it means that you're going to have to invest a fair bit of energy and time into forming a relationship based on trust. And you're really going to need to make sure that you follow through on what it is you say you're going to do, because it takes effort to be accepted into a community. And you must really work to maintain that trust once you've been accepted. So we then, and just sort of bringing it to an end here, talk about the importance of supporting community via differentiation. So this is, in long story short, differentiation is the process by which we help a community transition to a new sustainable structure. It's not the old community that it was. It's not completely new either, but it's a blend of the two. And the focus is always, or as best as is possible, on around community-led approaches, letting the community decide what's important for them rather than telling them what needs to occur, and supporting them in that process. And so that would start to look roughly something like this. So I'm going to pause there just before we wrap up for the session and just take any further questions that have come through.
Thanks, David. So I guess I'm going to treat these more as comments from Raza, who's joined us from Pakistan, actually. And I think the general gist of some of the comments are just basically how COVID is impacting us at a global scale, and that the mental health fallout from COVID is one of the major underlying impacts of the pandemic. And I suppose just sort of that recognition of the fact that we're all experiencing this as a collective. So I guess it also brings in difficulties of the support we're able to afford to others as well. So
yeah, it does. It's a really good point. What we've been talking about in a series of self-care sessions across the course of the last couple of weeks is that now is a really good time to be checking in with yourself. We're 5 or 6 months into it. I think we can all see that there's and feel the uncertainty in regard to the future, and we're probably all starting to catch a glimpse of how much longer this could go for. So therefore, bearing in mind our own health and well-being, now is a really important time, I think, to check in. And if you haven't developed a plan or have some strategies to reduce your stress levels, manage your cortisol, and plan for maintaining your overall health and well-being across the duration, if you haven't done that as yet, now is a really good time to do that.
thanks. I might give a little time for some more questions, but
yeah, sure.
Just one of the slides you mentioned cleavage planes. So in terms of entering into a community, how have you found that? Are there particular strategies that you'd use, or one could use to sort of make that initial contact, or to
manage them? Yeah, well, from a community recovery perspective, the formation of community recovery committees, often goes a long way to helping support communities, because the community, without again going into all of the detail, a community recovery committee will be comprised of nominated community representatives who can act as the voice for their community and identify different views and perspectives, and then discuss them amongst the community, with the aim of reaching some sort of collaborative resolution. So that would be one way, or is one way. Community information sessions is another as well, but even from a from the perspective of working as a health professional, with people, I guess what I'd say is, of course, we need to have the clinical lens and awareness, but we also, need to remember in our sessions the importance of validating people's views and experiences from within the community framework as well. So, if someone feels very strongly about something that is occurring within their community, I think it's important to neither agree nor disagree with them, but just support them to feel very heard.
Thanks. Darren, okay.
There's a few things coming through, I think.
Yeah. So I think this was, so Raza again has just sort of mentioned the priorities around health and mental health and social well-being, and how sort of, if we're focusing on that, then ultimately it'll, I suppose, lead to that broader social development, economic growth, when we are prioritizing our mental health. And I think that's a really good point to yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's going to be I suspect there's going to be such a significant need across the course of the coming months and the coming years, probably. I think we really need to look at what we can do outside of the clinical setting as well to assist communities to I think really support themselves and drive their own recovery.
And yeah, Richard has also just thanked you and said it's been a very informative, coherent and evidence-based presentation. And yeah, Richard, any resources that will need to be shared we'll send through the recovery at Red Cross. And also this talk will be on our YouTube channel.
Great. Well, thanks. I'll just mention before perhaps you finish up, but thanks everyone for joining the session. Again, thanks for taking the time out of your day and out of your week, and hopefully there's some good information in there that you could draw from and apply to your work in a clinical setting, and also in your work with communities. And just really encourage you as well to seek your own support and supervision, and also participate in continuing professional development too.
Thanks very much, David. It's been such an interesting presentation and so informative, and you can see that coming through in all of the comments. And I just wanted to thank all of the attendees for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this session. As I mentioned, very special thanks to our guest, David Younger. And just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded, and we will send you a link to the recording and all of the resources that have been mentioned, and a survey seeking your feedback. If you are on LinkedIn, we would encourage you to join us at the Disaster Recovery Practitioners Australia group to continue the conversation. The purpose of the group is to share information about the practice of disaster recovery for community members, local government, local organisations, schools, businesses, among other groups. There are many people who are going to face being in a recovery role for the first time and supporting communities as they recover. And so we're hoping to be able to link people up. If you are interested in more information on the other presentations and webinars that Red Cross run, please email our National Recovery team at recovery@redcross.org.au. And this was just one of a series of webinars that we Red Cross host. So we hope to see you at other webinars, and we hope to have David with us again in the future. Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and I hope you have a really great afternoon and a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.